Skal jeg bare gå? Ok. Welcome, and welcome to NUPI, and welcome to this book conversation about Peer Schouten's new book, Roadblock Politics, The Origins of Violence in Central Africa. We have a crowd in-house, and we also have some crowd online, and this seminar will also be streamed and will also be available thereafter on NUPI's YouTube and Facebook channels. And it's a great pleasure for me to have this conversation with Per about a book that I think is one of the most important books, not only about the D.R. Congo and the Central African Republic, not only about Africa, but about state building, power and authority that has been published in quite a long time, in fact. I'm deeply impressed by this book. Because what Per do is that he ties this phenomenon of these roadblocks that we find in various parts of the world, not only in Africa, but he ties it to different political patterns, to expressions of authority, expressions of resistance, expressions of withdrawal. But he also shows how these roadblocks are not sort of isolated phenomena far away in sort of states that we tend to toss off as fragile, weak, fragmented, all the possible adverbs that we have put on the African states and similar states, but also shows how these roadblocks are deeply integrated into the world economy, being sort of the outposts on global supply chains. So it's a book that I was deeply impressed by when I read it. It also took me down an interesting memory lane back to some of the work that I did in this part of the world quite some years ago in D.R. Congo and Goma, a town that I think is quite dear to both of us, even though you have visited much more than I have, but I also spent some time there. And so I very much look forward to this. This will be done as a conversation. I will ask a few questions. Per will do most of the talking because it's him that we want to listen to. But I will also come in at a few times with some questions to try to direct conversations. Every now and then, Per will also sort of illuminate parts of his arguments and presentations with a few slides. I've seen them. They are extremely illuminating and also a sign of the very impressive fieldwork that Per and colleagues has been conducting both in D.R. Congo and the Central African Republic, places where it's not necessarily easy to do fieldwork, to put it mildly. But to kick us off, Per, why roadblocks? Why did you get so into this issue in the first place? I mean, many of us who have sort of been in these areas, we have experienced the roadblock, but none of us had the imagination that you had to really start investigating this in the manner you have done. So please illuminate us, entertain us. Why roadblocks? Why this focus?
Well, thank you so much, Morten. But before I start, I want to start answering your question. I just want to say thank you to NUPI for having me over. Thank you all for joining, also online. And thank you to you, Morten, and the team for facilitating this. And most of all, thank you for your generous words. I think that if you praise my book so much, I can only disappoint in my presentation, but I will still do my best to deliver. So I think if I want to explain why I kind of started with roadblocks, I have to take you back to 2013, almost 10 years ago, and take you back with a small anecdote. Because in 2013, I was a kind of penniless grad student, had to scramble to gather money to do fieldwork in Congo. And then there was one Swedish organization, Diakonia, that asked me, you know, Peer, you're doing a lot of work there. Can you not help us out with a small study looking at multinational companies? If they would operate in Eastern Congo, what kind of security actors do they encounter? So we can make this a kind of lessons learned thing. So I'm Dutch, so I chose Heineken. I was doing my PhD on private security, so I expected private security companies on the payroll of this of Heineken to secure its installations. Perhaps the police or the army to offer some additional armed security. And I was talking about this with friends when one of my friends, Bonjean, told me, why don't you look at M23? And some of you might have heard of M23. It's an armed group that is now again causing quite some disturbances in Eastern Congo. Mutual allegations between Rwanda and the D.R.C. on involvement in supporting this armed group. And 10 years ago was the first time they appeared while I was doing my fieldwork on Heineken. And so Bonjean told me, why don't you look at M23? I was like, well, why should I look at this armed group, M23, as a security actor related to Heineken? And he says, well, it's actually very simple. And he produced this receipt, a lot more crumbled it was back then, out of his pocket. And he thought, here, look. And so what is actually you see here is you see a receipt produced by M23. Why do we know it's M23? Well, you know, it put its logo on the top, so it's quite obvious that this is an M23 receipt. And then it says Nature de la Marchandise, and that's Primus. Some of you might know it, others might not know it, but this is the flagship beer that Heineken produces in Congo and much of Central Africa. And really it's available in every small little village, right, of this huge country, just as big as Western Europe. So this receipt was for a truck. The montant en chiffres, so the amount is $320 that this truck of Heineken beer paid. And it was paid at Lieu de Signature du Taxateur at Kibumba, which is the name of one checkpoint that M23 operated. So that was a mind-blowing moment for me, because I had passed so many roadblocks, right, in my previous field work, going to these remote mining sites, because I was interested in conflict minerals. We all were at the time, because we thought that was the main funding, the main driver of conflict and the financing of conflict in Eastern Congo, right? So I had passed many roadblocks on the way to the mines, but I never gave them second thought. But now, with this receipt, I started to ask some questions. We further dug into this case, and we found out that Heineken, over the period of probably a year, we calculated they paid probably around $1 million to M23 via the checkpoints, you know, for the beer distribution, for the beer to reach customers at all these small villages in Eastern Congo. And then, of course, we wondered if this is just one multinational company, right? And one armed actor and its roadblocks. And we've passed so many, and people talk about it anecdotally. What if you start looking at all these roadblocks, right? And all the multinational entities, whether corporate or humanitarian, and how they encounter or engage with these roadblocks. So basically that has set me on a journey, and over the last 10 years nearly, a bit less, we have mapped over 1,500 roadblocks in 3 different African countries. Right here on the left you see just 2 provinces of Eastern Congo, and we mapped 800 roadblocks in just these 2 provinces, right? And you see all these colorful dots, and then there's areas without the colorful dots. And the areas without the colorful dots, not because there's no roadblocks, but simply because we ran out of money to actually map them, right? So there's a lot more in just these 2 provinces than what we have mapped. Over to the Central African Republic, we mapped around 300 roadblocks there, half of them under control of armed groups. So an important part of the kind of taxation of flows goes directly into the funding of these armed groups that operate in this part. And then finally, and this is not part of the book, there's South Sudan, right, where we recently, last year, finished a countrywide mapping, also around 300 roadblocks. And these roadblocks here are really literally lodged on the main routes through which aid is distributed in the country. So there's some one and twos to put together, and then you get a very complicated picture. Now, the roadblocks in each of these cases look very similar, but the politics, of course, is very different, right? So I think maybe we have a chance to talk about that later. But what we discovered when we looked at M23, and I'll stop there with my answer to your question. This is an M23 roadblock. It would look pretty much the same today as it did 10 years ago, because the people involved are the same. We dug around and we obtained some documents of M23 itself, internal documentation that we then gave to the UN. And just to illustrate how important roadblocks were for this armed group, in July, the chief of finance of M23, Erasto Bahati, wrote a memo complaining that the activities of the Mai Mai and Nyatura, so other armed groups, right, were decreasing traffic through its territory, thereby leading to a loss in taxes. So M23, did not control any mining sites at all, So of course then roadblocks become a much more important thing and a kind of integral element to its logistical and mobilization strategy to keep itself well funded and supplied ammunition and to keep its soldiers loyal, etc., etc. So I think we can go into it later, but so all of this anecdote of M23 basically set me out on a journey to explore the politics of roadblocks, and I think I've just been scratching the surface until now. But I hope we can talk a bit more about that. Yeah.
We definitely should. But first, I would like to sort of point out that, well, I think you do another great thing in this book, and that is also that you put sort of the history of the roadblock into both a larger picture in East Africa, but you also point to the fact that the roadblock and the history of the roadblock is something that we conveniently has chosen to forget about European history. So maybe you could sort of illuminate also that part of the book a little bit, because I think that's also a fascinating part of it, how you both put the current roadblocking and politics of roadblock in D.R.C. into a larger historical pattern and a history that goes much deeper than only colonial history. But also some of the examples you show from the UK and France, that the roadblock has also been integral to the political history of France, UK, and a number of other European countries. But we have, for some reasons, I mean, historians seems to mainly have written them out of European history, which is rather strange. And we ended up with this phenomenon that the roadblock is sort of equivalent to a place like D.R. Congo, Liberia during the war, and so on and so forth. So please.
Absolutely, I think that's wonderful what you say there. I think it boils down to me I was having talks about my roadblock research with a German friend, and he says, "Oh, do you know the story of Michael Koolhaas?" I said, "Michael Koolhaas, what is this? What is this?" And this is a German novel from the 19th century that has now been turned to a feature movie with Mads Mikkelsen, if you like Mads Mikkelsen, a famous Danish actor. And the story is about a minor gentry person in the 15th century, and he's quite famous in Germany because he was a friend of Martin Luther, and he corresponded with Martin Luther. And he wants to take some of his cattle to the market to sell, and he has to pass through Saxony to do so. And in Saxony, he stopped at the roadblock by the ruler or some of the aristocratic people in charge of Saxony. And it's just one time too many for him, and he goes absolutely berserk, and he raises an army of people who are also disfranchised with the exactions on trade routes, and he attacks all of these roadblocks, right, in Germany. And so he's a kind of rebellious figure that has a big place in German history from the 15th century. And that just got me thinking, like, you know, I've heard in Denmark about the sound toll. I heard that along the Rhine there's more tolls than miles, is a famous saying in Germany. So I think that there's something in the prehistory of the modern state which required some investigating, and I thought I would do the same for Africa, and I hope to be able to show you one image of what I found. So it turns out that if you ask, when did this all start, these roadblocks, right? You can say the roadblocks that are now started with the Congo Wars in Eastern Congo. But it turns out that the rebels only copied them from the army of Zaire, Mobutu's army, which was notoriously underfunded and financed itself through these roadblocks. And if you even go deeper, it turns out, and there's a wonderful paper by Catherine Newbury about this, that these roadblocks operated by the Congolese state agencies and chiefs had themselves often been put into place in colonial times. Now then you come back to a quite comfortable place in African studies and histories of explanations of the evils that are today part of post-colonial condition. Namely, it's the fault of the colonial administration. But then I tried to dig a little bit deeper, and by reading some of the text of explorers that first made it to Central Africa, right? And basically, if you open any kind of explorer account, you know, I'm here talking about Livingstone, Stanley, Speke, and some of these other famous people who traveled along these pre-colonial highways. And if you open them on any page, chances are it will talk about these encounters with local chiefs and local communities and negotiations around the terms of passage. Right? Transit, right of transit. And there's one key Swahili word, a Swahili word, which figures time and again, and it is called hongo. And today hongo means bribe, but back in the day, it just was a technical term. You know, Swahili was a trade language, a technical term for transit tax. And it turns out that as kind of long-distance trade intensified in the 19th century, mainly driven by demand for ivory in Europe and the US, caravan trade gets more intensive. And these African communities who live along these trade routes, they're being a bit upset with all these people passing through, and you know, sometimes there's some quarrels, and some they fight a bit, and etc. So they start to organize, and they start to transform chiefly power, which used to be about rainmaking, etc., into worldly powers. All of a sudden, chief had to have an army to be able to defend himself and impose these transit taxes upon these strangers passing through their land. And so pervasive is this phenomenon, and so profitable, that it cost about 25% for each caravan, right, of what they were carrying. They would have to pay in bribes along these trade routes. But chiefs who lived like up the hills a bit away from the trade routes actually moved down to the trade routes to also set up their little roadblock polities. And this became a kind of driving force of state formation in this part of the world. There's a wonderful PhD thesis, quite obscure, from the 80s, of a lady who has tracked how many chiefs there were in one part, Ugogo here, and how many of them levied these transit taxes. Turns out all of them, so 32. So any kind of traveler from the coast wanting to go into the interior of Africa would have to pass by 32 roadblocks at least, right? And pay. That was just a normal practice. So this is something that is happening in Africa. You might say, okay, this is African experience, creative response to these external phenomenon, but it's not, right? Because, I mean, does anybody know what this map is of? Which area?
Washington, D.C.
Yeah, the British version of it. It's London, indeed, yes. And what it shows is these dots, and these are toll gates in the greater London area. I'm guessing it's about 30 or 40 of them, maybe, something like that, right? But then the fine print goes like, the whole of the sidebars are not shown. They are upward of 100 in number, in just the London area, right? It turns out there were about 8,000 turnpikes and toll gates in the UK, in the Great Britain, in the 19th century. Exactly at the same time that the Africans were kind of inventing roadblocking as a kind of political economic strategy. This had a huge, deep history in Europe, right? In France, at the same time, there were about 4,000. Still, until the end of the 19th century, the gabelle, the salt tax, was very important for local administrations. I mentioned the Rhine before. So before states controlled their transport networks, before they had the kind of infrastructural and logistical power to centralize taxes and to centralize control over their territories, what they basically did most of the time was sit down by the side of the road, you know, and basically force people to pay if they wanted to pass. I think Fernand Braudel puts this very beautifully. He says, before the 19th century, capital concentrated in the sphere of circulation, right? Not in production. It moved into production later on. And then what political authorities do is try to control the channels through which this value passes, or at least portions of them, right? And I think he's basically spot on right in describing this kind of prehistory of the modern state. And this is where it gets interesting, we tend to think that modern states, you know, they arrived and then this whole story ended. Because infrastructural power is now so widespread along the world that all states can kind of control the territory. But in the D.R. Congo, Central African Republic, and many other places around the world, the heyday of this kind of state which is able to control its territory and transport network lies in the past. Because since independence, maybe since the 70s or 80s, you have structural adjustment, states lose control progressively over their transport networks. You get ruination of road networks, and the friction of terrain kind of re-emerges. And with that, the conditions of possibility for roadblocking as a political strategy, right? Not just a strategy of accumulation that can be deployed by anybody who wishes to just take a bit out of trade, but also as a kind of political strategy to make political claims. Re-emerges. Just I can give you a small picture of what the road network is now, right? I mean, the Belgians made sure they understood this thing about infrastructural power. They made out of Congo the most infrastructure-dense colony in the whole of Africa. It vied with South Africa in terms of industrialization. But in the 60s and 70s, this infrastructure network kind of, retracts to these very few corridors. And what you get back to is again this condition of possibility for roadblock politics to emerge. So I think in making that historical argument, you also have to start thinking about what is feasible for people who are aspiring state makers, and what is the most logical or intuitive strategy that they can resort to if you don't have these very dense kind of infrastructural possibilities to govern your people and territory, right?
And in the book you talk about this as what I think the expression you use is portable sovereignty. And of course that gives you an idea also about that this is in a way sort of, it's a manifestation of some sort of statecraft on a shoestring budget. Because when you talk, of course there are differences between roadblocks. Some are more heavily guarded than others. Some are more, sort of with real walls and fences and these kind of things. But many of them are just a rope across a road.
Yeah, this is a typical roadblock, right? But I think I like the most typical roadblock is actually, I took one actually for you guys to show you what a roadblock is. Is this right? It's a piece of string, and as you say, it's a form of portable sovereignty because. You can put it here on the road. You can help me, Morten. We can make a roadblock together here.
Yeah.
And then everybody wants to pass. We will make them pay. If we want to be convincing, we have a Kalashnikov on our shoulder, just so people get the message, right? But if we are chased by our enemies, the government comes in and says, well, you should not be doing this. This is our place. Then we take it back. We put it back into our pockets. If you're a guerrilla, that's very practical, right? Because you need to run away sometimes. But then every time you kind of redeploy in a new place, what you do is take it back out of your pocket and put it up again. So of course, in the kind of handbook of aspiring guerrillas, the roadblock will figure very highly because it's just so easy to do. And if you are under arms full time, you cannot make your own money by cultivating or something like it. So you need to resort to some kind of way to extract wealth from people, right? And I think that because roadblock, you can source locally if you don't have a cord with you, right? You can just take some pieces. So everybody can make a roadblock, basically.
Everybody can make one, but you still need to have. You mentioned the Kalashnikov, and that also to me suggests that the effectiveness of a roadblock goes together with at least the ability to some extent express and project fear. Must be an element in it.
Yeah.
But maybe not only the element of fear, but also, is it possible to think also about a roadblock as some sign of modernity and predictability? Because if you go back to the picture you had, this one is, it's quite orderly. Mm-hmm. And most roadblocks that I have passed through are quite orderly. There's only one time I have really been afraid at a roadblock in D.R. Congo, and that was at one of the main roadblocks just outside Goma on the Rutsuru highway, which I passed through many times. The only reason I was afraid this time was that the FARDC soldiers who were there, they were confronted by the presidential guard of Kabila because he was coming on a visit to Goma, and they were definitely not on friendly terms to the extent that they were shouting, they were pushing. It was really aggressive. So I remember saying to my colleague that watch out now. Here all hell could break loose, and if it do, I'm going to just push you under that car and crawl in beside you because everything can happen here. Yeah. It was such an aggressive attitude. But most of the time, that's not the case.
Right. So insisting on the fact that you can move around roadblocks is not the same as saying that they move around all the time, right? Actually, a lot of them are very stable because they're at very logical places like a bridge or a junction or the place where a footpath towards a mine meets the main road. So people have to transship from what they're carrying onto a truck. So it's a beautiful place to mount a roadblock. So a lot of these roadblocks are quite stable in their location. What might happen, of course, is that they change hands, is that a rebel group operates the roadblock, the army comes in, and then because the people around them are used to the roadblock, the army will just maintain it. So the roadblock changes hands, but it will stay there, right? And this predictability is, of course, nice for the roadblockers, because it means that people will not resist too much against the roadblock. But it's also nice for the people who are the road users, because they need to be able to calculate beforehand how much money they will need to bring to be able to get from A to B, right? And truckers, you can take any trucker in this part of the world and they say, okay, if you want to get from this town to that town, even if it's 500 kilometers, they will be able to list all the roadblocks, exactly how much they cost, right? Which ones are new, which ones are old. This is their livelihood, so of course they are experts in navigating this landscape, right? But I think there's something quite interesting what you mentioned about the Kalashnikovs, because this is a map of just the roadblocks in North and South Kivu, without any background, right? And what you see is just this patchwork of dots, no? And basically, this is a better proxy probably for the road network than any map that exists, because there literally is not a road where there is not, right, a roadblock. It's also a very good proxy, I think, for density of economic exchanges, because where you see them clustering around, there's probably more to be had than in the kind of places where they're more dispersed, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at it like this looks like a kind of extractive landscape, right? It looks like these are people who probably have a Kalashnikov, and they're all using a Kalashnikov to extract wealth from people. And I think this is reality, and people suffer enormously for its effects. They also invent creative ways around it. Maybe we can get back to that. But there's something more complicated going on, and there's also many roadblocks which actually are not held by armed men or are not extractive in intent. Now, to explain that, we need to just superimpose another map. This is the latest map of the Kivu security tracker, mapping the number of armed groups. And by the latest count in Eastern Congo, there is over 120 different armed groups, right? So this is completely nuts, right? It's really, really a lot. Many of those, though, are not, semi-armies or big groups. There might be a handful, 30 people, right? Or 100 people maybe. They might not be very well organized, but there's something more interesting going on, actually, because we tend to call them Mai-Mai. The majority of these armed groups are Mai-Mai. And it turns out that many of these Mai-Mai groups are actually community militia.
Maybe you should explain that term, Mai-Mai, to those that are not familiar with it.
Mai-Mai comes from water. Mai means water in Kiswahili. And the story goes that, just like the anti-Balaka in the Central African Republic, that they have these special protections, dawa, and special rituals that they use to make themselves, protect themselves against bullets, so that bullets will just pass through them, right? And bullets will turn into water. And so they have these beliefs that they use as part of their strategies of warfare. But these are community militia. So each community might have their own militia, and because the communities have been reshuffled because of the conflict so much, there's a few Hunde over here, few Hunde over there. They're not connected anymore, but they're interspersed with the Nande and so all these other different communities. They're all kind of mixed up, and imagine there's a road passing through, this patchwork of communities, and if one community militia puts up a roadblock, then the community next door will be like, now they're making money out of this truck, right? Out of the trucking, and so there's an imbalance in wealth and power between the communities. So what they will do in turn is that the neighboring community will also set up a roadblock, right? They will mobilize, set up a roadblock, because they want to restore this fragile equilibrium that exists between these communities, and the kind of fear of one of them becoming more powerful is itself a driver for communities in the pre-colonial period as well as now to resort to strategies of armed mobilization, right? But it's also an expression of anxiety with mobility. If a truck with an NGO or a person like you and me comes into this area, people want to stop you because they want to find out, who are you? Where are you going? Very normal questions. Yep. But also, what does your passing through here have as an impact on this equilibrium between us? Because if you decide to stop in a neighboring village and start talking to people there, maybe they will gain some advantage which we won't. So there's a complete anxiety with long-distance trade and exchange and circulation of flows and information over long distances, that people use roadblocks as an articulation, right? A frontier of resistance against the nefarious impacts of this unbridled exchange over distance.
Certainly. Another thing, I mean, which sort of struck me reading this book is, of course, the necessity of not only understanding context, but understanding landscapes and geography. I mean, right now, I mean, I do most of my work in the Sahel, and I mean, the kind of roadblock that we just saw a picture of here, where you have dense, you have a gravel forest road, and then you have dense forest on each side. Parts of the Sahel doesn't look like that. I mean, our roadblock. I mean, last evening we talked a little bit about Niger and Agadez and the mine of Chebrekan. And I mean, a roadblock to Chebrekan wouldn't make any sense because I mean you could just drive around it. I mean, there are really no roads. I mean, people use whatever is possible, and there are other possible places. But there are, of course, other ways of making certain that you can gain from somebody going through your territory, and that is, of course, the fear factor. But have we sort of become so overwhelmed by our own virtuality that we have forgotten the fact that geography matters? And if you look at the geography here, I mean, isn't it the fact that these areas of the world is one of the most conducive to roadblock politics?
Yeah.
Take us through a little journey on one of these roads, Per, that we have traveled so often.
Well, as I said before, you know, people are really good at avoiding roadblocks as well because, hey, they live with it, and people are very creative in general, right? So if you are a villager walking with your, you know, produce to the market, and you know that there's going to be a roadblock, you can just walk into the bush, you know, and go around it, circumvent the roadblock. But of course, if they find you, you have a big problem, right? So, but if you're a truck, you can't quite do that because there's forest on each side, so you cannot just make a detour through the forest and pass through the roadblock, right? So that's why I think that roadblocking is particularly great if there's no kind of exit routes, right, for people to kind of circumvent them. And that is typically at the entry points, obligatory passage points, you know, like bridges, entry points to mines, to towns, junctions, intersections. This is a whole kind of terrain, logistical terrain, which makes sense for roadblockers. If you're an aspiring roadblocker, you will want to be in these places and not in the places where it's easy to circumvent, right? That said, I do believe that even in the Sahel and other places, roadblocking is a widespread strategy, right? Yeah, and so.
But they are more virtual than physical.
Absolutely, absolutely. So there's more abstract ways of translating the capacity to stop someone from passing into power, whether symbolic or financial or political, right? But I think there's something really interesting to ask also, is like, how do multinationals like Heineken navigate this landscape, right? We've just seen the map of Eastern Congo's roadblocks. How does a company like Coca-Cola, you can get Coca-Cola everywhere, you can get Nestlé everywhere, you can get Heineken everywhere, Ericsson and Huawei have antennas everywhere, there's NGOs and multinationals traveling across all these roads. How do they move with this, right? And I think that the long and short of it is that they don't. Because multinational companies outsource logistics to logistical giants like Bolloré, which is a quite famous one in Africa. And they offer their clients this, you know, a map of Africa, and then they say total logistics. You come to the port with your stuff, we will do the paperwork, we will take it from the port, clear customs, put it onto our trucks or trains, and drive it into the interior and deliver it to the last end of the mile, to the last customer, right? And if you look at the map, that's pretty much what the map seems to promise. But it's a lie, because Bolloré does not have, you know, except a couple of offices here and there. They own a couple of ports, sure, one or two rail lines, but that's it. But instead what they do is they take the contract from these multinationals and then themselves outsource it to a layer of regional or national transport companies. Often they have also small air-conditioned offices at airports or ports, and they market themselves with problematic names like Imperial Logistics or Frontier Services Group by Eric Prince. And yeah, things that we wouldn't quite use is moving cargo where others don't dare into the heart of Africa, right? So they use this trope of Africa, Central Africa, very Conradian, as dangerous, as something that you don't want to meddle with. And that is, of course, where they make their money, right? In selling Africa as dangerous, they are the ones who can do it. So they're very expensive. It would be great if it would be stopping there. but actually often they themselves outsource logistics to national transport operators or individual trucks who have 1 or 2 trucks. And so by the time you get from Heineken, multinational company, to a roadblock encounter between Heineken's products and a rebel, there's like 5 layers of outsourcing, right? Which makes it completely unaccountable and untraceable what the connection is between Heineken, right? So there's a kind of machinery of unaccountability built into the way that global supply chains work in the global south, which makes it possible for them to be completely imbricated structurally with these conflict economies. Because there's also no way that rebels or soldiers are being held accountable for taxing global supply chains and global companies and global flows. So there's actually more incentive for them to tax these global companies because they have more money. The transporters will invoice it somehow onwards, right? So there's a kind of structural imbrication of global supply chains and local conflict economies, which is getting more and more intense. And there's more and more instances of it coming up. This is in Iraq. It was just recently, a month ago, revealed that Ericsson has structurally paid millions of dollars to IS checkpoints, Islamic State checkpoints there. Lafarge, French company, ISIS checkpoints in Syria. We have Castel Group, a wine company from France, paying rebels in the Central African Republic to checkpoints. So more and more these incidents coming up, which I think reveal not one company gone wrong, but the structural implication of multinational companies with conflict economies in the global south, right?
Excellent. Something that really, for me, begs a question is, of course, that with all, the money involved, for example, like you documented how much money very likely Heineken had paid to M23, but also other groups, and some of these roadblocks generate an awful lot of money. Many of them are very small and do not generate much at all, but some of the most important ones, generates a lot of money. But still, we are talking about an area of, as you said, about 120 armed groups, and it's not North and South Kivu. It's not enormously large territories. So here it seems, if you sort of would have looked at this with sort of the eyes of someone inspired by Charles Tilly, for example, you could have then predicted that, the accumulation of wealth there would lead somebody eventually to gain a monopoly on certain roads, which again would enable them to expand their territory so that more and more of these would be brought under some sort of monopoly control. You have in your book, I suppose, some historical and contemporary examples of people who have tried, and it lasted for a while and then it failed again. So it sort of begs the question, why? Why is this sort of area seemingly the opposite to a Tillian prediction?
Yeah, I think in Congo what you actually see is the opposite to the Tillian story. It's actually the fragmentation over time of control over logistical space or terrain tout court, if you want. But you can see here there's a difference in color. And this is like a screenshot from our interactive web map. Huh? So if you want, you can go into it and you can actually click on each roadblock. There will be a picture, how many people, how many guns, who do they tax, see when was it established. It's a lot of granular data in there. But the brown ones are state-controlled checkpoints, and mostly the army. The army is the main roadblock operator in the country, in Congo. So it's a kind of cheap way for the government to have a operational presence in Eastern Congo, but also a cheap way to distract the generals and make them, occupy themselves with filling their pockets in Eastern Congo, so that they won't really, go to Kinshasa and hold them accountable or anything. And so this is the main roads where the army and the government is, right? And it's along the footpaths into the hills, more remote areas where you find red checkpoints, which are the armed group checkpoints. But what is a main road is a philosophical question almost, and it's a seasonal question. James Scott said something funny, namely that states in Southeast Asia are seasonal phenomena. And I think this applies to a lot of places in the world. If you have a rainy season and all the roads wash away because it's all beaten earth roads, in the rainy season it becomes mud, and taking, what in the dry season takes 2 hours, in the rainy season might take a day. So a main road in the rainy season can become a rebel-controlled footpath, right? So there's a seasonality to this map as well, probably, I mean, my dream would be to do this in the dry season and the rainy season and the next dry season. So you can see this fluctuation of control because the army kind of moves out if it's muddy. You know, it's like, okay, there's not much trucks to be taxed here, so we kind of, you know, move out again. And then the next dry season they come back and there's some battles over who can control the roadblocks. And you see the seasonality of roadblocks and fights about control over regional logistical space in South Sudan as well. In the rainy season, people move, armed actors move towards the Nile River, because that's when all the humanitarian aid is shipped by boat. And the road network, 60% of it is unusable. So why have a checkpoint? You know, you go back to farming, and then when the road dries up again, you put your roadblocks back again, right?
It's also, I mean, your latter point is also, I think, very important because it points to also both the occupational dimension of violence in this part of the world, but also the seasonal part of it. It's, in several parts of this part of the world. I mean, violence has also become occupational, but also sort of a seasonal occupation almost. But I wanted to sort of, before we open it up to some questions and comments, there's a lot of there's quality people in the room, so I expect them to have some comments and questions. In one part of the book, which is a great narrative in itself, where you talk about where you are going into this FDLR village. FDLR is sort of a rebel group in Eastern Congo that is sort of what remains of people that once upon a time were deeply involved in the Rwandan genocide. So it's once upon a time it was an external movement. Now it has become internal, external, or whatever you should call it. It's a strange being, but it's also much feared. They have a capacity for even quite gruesome acts of violence at times, but they're also integrated into certain local communities.
Social fabric,
yeah. Anyway, I mean, this sort of begs the question about, I mean, didn't you have any doubts going in there? And that is one thing. But the second thing, I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of the nitty-gritty of this type of fieldwork, because, I mean, if you mapped all of this, I mean, obviously you have not visited all these roadblocks yourself. You have visited many of them, but not all of them. So how was this work actually organized? How did you manage to get this work done? I'm a little curious. So please enlighten us about the fieldwork aspects of your work.
It's also a nice opportunity to kind of thank and point out that this is a work of co-production. So I have perhaps visited 20% of all these 1,500 roadblocks myself, and the rest was done in partnership with local activists and researchers that we trained together with the Belgian NGO IPIS to use mobile data collection technologies of geocoding and survey data. So a lot of the work has been done by them, and also a lot of the focus of the research has been informed by them, because in part the selection of the areas where we went was because they wanted to explore in their own communities, right, what was happening, or to denounce a particularly fierce armed group that they had troubles with for a long time. And so that inspired also some of the case studies, and the focus and the stories that we were able to tell was because of the local partners in this and the local activists. And they took we organized a big session together with them, with the UN, all the NGOs and the civil society and the media in Congo and CAR, and to be able to expound and to share. And they took the data and the results, presented it to the governor, presented it to different government offices, started reporting on it in the media, so that this whole thing is a kind of collective effort, and it lives its own life, right, outside of this book. And this book is more my kind of thoughts and theories about it that have nothing to do with the collective effort of mapping them, right? So that's important to do. And that's also to say it's collective is also to say that my choices in conducting fieldwork were always informed by my local partners, right? If I said I would love to go to this area because I've heard something about the roadblock over there, then I would start asking, is this possible? Do you know someone? And in this part, particularly in Eastern Congo, but everywhere around the world, things like that depend on who you know and how they know the people they know in the places you want to go, right? So if you want to move from Goma to an armed group area, you need to assemble a lot. It's actually assembling. You need to assemble people that can vouch for each other, and then that know people inside the armed group, and then the armed group know these people in a certain kind of way as family members, etc., etc. So by the time that you arrive in this area, you probably have a lot of people in your car, because one needs to know the local army officer, the other needs to know the local, brigade commander or the tax authority, and some people in the villages of civils. So it's a lot of work like that, and you're absolutely dependent on and in the hands of these people, because what do you know, right? What do you know? You arrive in a place, and everything is dependent on the people that you trust and the way that they have trust relationships with other people, and so you can feel very scared because you're absolutely dependent on. You feel like a little child again because you're utterly dependent on other people, right, for your safety and security. And so, of course, a lot of times I was very nervous, and even more nervous when my local assistants were getting nervous, if I could see that, right? So that's absolutely difficult to do. But I think my philosophy has always been rebels are people too, and they love to give their side of the story. If you just explain to them, I'm here because a lot of people talk about you, but they never ask you about your perspective in this. Then they're very happy to sit down with you, and they will give you, some story. It's a bit of a question how useful it is, but oftentimes it's just people, right? And slowly you build up connections, and you can start calling them, WhatsApping them, and before you know it, you have great sources, right?
Yes, in some part of the world, this is still possible. Not everywhere. It depends on the kind of narratives that drives the rebellion. And here, when it comes to at least my movements, it's more about some sort of expression of local, but perhaps also youthful resistance against something, be it the state, be it against any an external force, but also sometimes it's in the village itself, intergenerational, but people like you and me are really sort of their primary targets. Before we open up, just one final short question, and that is sort of, how do you see your book and your perspective with regard to the sort of larger sort of canon of state-building literature that sort of, by and large, has ignored this part of acting as a sovereign or a would-be sovereign? Do you see this as a sort of something that complements what is already there, or do you basically see it as this is an alternative story of the art of trying to be or become a sovereign?
I think it's a good question. I'm not sure, but I'm hovering between two positions. The first is that we tend to think of states as this kind of bulky, vast apparatus that controls a territory and the whole of the population within it. It's quite a lot of work to do so, right? Yeah. And that image stems, I think, ultimately from late 19th century, early 20th century, when we actually, states got the capacity to do so, and then we somehow projected it backwards into history, but also to other places in the world. But most of the time, in most places in the world, states or state actors or people who may claim to state-like capacities never had this form of infrastructural logistical power or the ambition to control a whole territory or the entire population and all of its activities in it. And if you look back into history and you see that actually what most of them have been doing, anybody who laid claim to power, was just sit down by the road. It's quite comfortable, you can just sit and maybe find some shadow, or if it rains, and just wait for people to pass, right? So if that's the case, then I think, instead of territory or population, I think that circulation, right, as a kind of prime mode of state building, state formation, and its contestation, is absolutely a valid alternative way of thinking about it. But of course, it is also very much imbricated control over logistical space in control over territory, right? If you control a roadblock on the only access road to a mining site, it can for all purposes be said that you control the mining site, right? So it's a strategy of territorial control. People control town when they control the checkpoints on the entry roads to the town, right? So control over people, especially in South Sudan, is done through checkpoints by the SPLA, right? And they put people into camps, displace them into camps or villages, take them out of the countryside, put checkpoints around them. Voila, you control the people, right? So we also need to think more in a more sophisticated way about conflict minerals, control over population and territory, and what actually is the practical way that people do so, right?
And perhaps the key word is control in one way or another. Either sort of this expansive state control or this sort of more, let's say, on a shoestring budget control, but it's control nevertheless.
Yeah, I think the last example I want to give is, for me the epiphany was the ISIS map in 2015. There was a map produced of the territory that ISIS controlled, and it wasn't this cloud of terrain, but it was these very thin slivers that you could see running through the Iraq-Syria borderlands, these very thin lines, and it was roads, oil pipelines, right, and some connections between some towns and junctions. And of course, in this geography there, it doesn't make sense to control desert or empty space. So if you're an armed group and you want to make a point, you're going to control the main junctions, intersections, and connections, right? And that's the only thing you need to do to be able to control territory. So people, I wish we could all work together to have a better spatial mapping of where armed groups and state actors actually are, because I have to guess that it will be a lot of conflicts, but also forms of state building efforts will revolve around logistical space.
Excellent. I think I then will open it up for some comments and questions. I mean, I hope there will be some. It should almost be some. I see Cedric, I see Kari. So Kari Osland from NUPI, please.
Thank you so much. Very fascinating. I have many questions, but I will ask two. So first of all, I was wondering whether you traced how the money were used. I mean, personal gains, redistribution into the close-by village, etc., because that also goes into this, social contract, state building. And the second question, I was wondering, did you see a differentiation as for who were taxed and how much in terms of gender, occupation, insider, outsider, etc., etc.? Thank you so much.
Great questions.
I think we'll collect a few, if that's okay with you, Per. So, Cedric, please.
Thank you very much. I had a question about security in the sense that, if I think back of your earlier example, for instance, of explorers and those, typically you would, come into a territory, you would pay homage to the king, but then you would also be escorted up to the end of the territory that the king controls with security. So does this paying of a tax kind of at a roadblock sometimes also comes with the provision of security then on that line? And the other question related to that is perhaps a kind of a example of authority or legitimacy. And I guess here I'm thinking of, especially in Somalia with Al-Shabaab, which is kind of known as you get a receipt and then you won't be taxed again on that whole route that they control. So it shows some form of organization, some form of coordination, some form of legitimacy. Do you see that as well amongst certain armed groups? Thank you.
Great. I see a few more, but I think since it was basically 4 questions and they are they're quite comprehensive. I know you can tackle them, but I think I will give you the opportunity to take them now, and then we take another round of Q&A. So please.
They're lovely questions, and I mean, I spent a lot of time on each of the questions actually in the book. But I'll try to give the short version. I think there's 2 ways of redistribution behind the roadblocks, but this is based on scratching the surface because, of course, this is a secret, right? That often people don't want to reveal what they do with the money and how it's being split up. But then again, when you sit down with a beer with someone, you start to get to know them. Of course, they will tell you what they do, right? So it turns out that if an army commander controls an area, if he's deployed to a commander to secure an area, he's deployed along a road. They will literally say in the command, you take this X, right, this road X. And what the commander will do is put his soldiers at different points to secure the road. But these are roadblocks, right? And whether it's a police commander or an army commander or some other kind of authority, he will tell each of these positions, maybe it's 2 or 3 people, to each week send him $40 or $100, depending on how profitable the place is. So this is a kind of franchise tax farming machinery where money is sent upwards to the commander, because if you don't do so, you will be put somewhere where there's nobody, right? And then the commander himself needs to send something upwards as well. And so you get a chain of vertical redistribution, right? Behind the roadblock. And a lot of government in these places works like this. It's informal alliances that people patronage, they put you in a place, which is great because you can make a lot of money. And then, right, but you also have to think about the big boss in the back of your head. If you, there's also rebel groups which help the army fight other rebel groups, and then as a reward, the commander gets control for a couple of months over a profitable roadblock, so he can make some money. But there's also these community roadblocks I talked about, right? And there you see forms of horizontal redistribution, if you will, in the local community, also taking place, right? But it's an empirical question for almost every roadblock and every local, because it's also fragmented. What exactly is the scheme and what is the division? And it can change over time, so it's very difficult to say something in general about all of the roadblocks. But very systematic it seems to be that armed groups, more organized armed groups, and the states have this pyramid scheme thing, right? Whereby roadblocks are actually posts to make money for the big man or woman as well. Differences in taxes is fascinating, and it's a lot to say about that. Yes, there is differences. Women tend to be taxed less. In Central African Republic and South Sudan, villagers are not taxed, but only trucks. And then foreign truckers are being taxed more than national truckers. So there's all kinds of things involved in these differences, which become part of the politics, right? Of who will then use the road and who will use who to use the road. A funny anecdote is that because truckers get taxed so much, there's many army commanders who move into logistics because they know that they are exempt from their own taxes. So if they use their army trucks to ship charcoal or ferry other products along these roads, they will sell it at the same price, but keep the difference, right? So the implication of logistics and militarization is much more complex and intense, actually. In South Sudan, you cannot be a trucking company without having a general, right, on your board, so to say. Escorts and security, wonderful question. If you are a trucker in any part of these countries that I've mentioned, but also probably Somalia, you need to have a general, a phone number at hand of a general who you pay periodically, so that if you pass the roadblocks, you can just show the phone number. It's like, oh, call him, you know. So people find ways around these roadblocks. There's also documents called laissez-passer, which you can purchase from a general. There's people army commanders or rebels who try to systematically take out all the roadblocks on the road and then provide security for a whole stretch of roads. There's people who turn roadblocking power into mobile, portable forms of sovereignty, so escorting, providing escorts along roads. So there's all kinds of variations and responses and to this roadblocking story. Legitimacy is very important, and I asked a lot of people, like, what do you think about these roadblocks? And most people, the first thing they will say is I hate them. But then if you start to ask more specific questions, like what do you think of this roadblock and that roadblock, one is by the community militia and one is by the army. They tax just the same, but people still prefer the one that is operated by their own community militia, right? And there's also discriminatory taxes against people from neighboring communities. So it's a very complicated patchwork of interlocking. So roadblocks, even if they're so nimble as a simple court, they bundle so much politics, right, in them, and which makes it very difficult to pick apart, right? You can pick them apart analytically, but for people there, this roadblock is just a dense bundle of symbolic and economic and tribal sometimes politics. Yeah.
Let's see, we had Kjetil and Stein. Decide who, the one that gets the mic first, talks first.
Thanks for a fascinating talk. This is really very interesting. I was struck by a parallel to corruption in kind of far more bureaucratic states, or states that have huge administrative apparatus, which is the concept of red tape, right? Is the red tape, which is basically a bureaucratic roadblock for businesses who would like to do something in a country. And then you have this, someone is able to put up a barrier because they control something, and they can deter you, and they put up this roadblock, and often with the tacit acknowledgement or awareness of the kind of leaders of the state who use this as a way to keep parts of the elite in line, right? As you said, it was a parallel to what you described, that you let these officers have these roadblocks and things like that. But in the case of bureaucratic states, it's always a trade-off, because too much red tape just kills everything, right? Because there's no investment coming in anymore. And I wonder if there's something, if a regulation of similar regulation in this case, that, just a basic question: who decides the price level of a roadblock, and can you put any price, and in that case actually destroy the entire trade? Because where's the limit of what is possible to enforce? How does this work?
I love your comparison with the red tape and then the roadblock as it's both a kind of cord, right? That you can put in front something to make things more complicated, and to translate that possibility of doing that into a financial, kind of incentive or bargaining process. So I think that's absolutely wonderful. And I think that much of the same dynamics are at work with roadblocks, and you see some roadblocks operators making a mistake of asking way too much, and then the motorcycle taxis or the truckers will just come together, with or without help from the local militia, and burn the roadblock, right? Or organize a day where nobody moves in towns, right? In Goma, La Lucha, an organization that is in Goma, Eastern Congo, they organize marches and things to denounce roadblock taxes. After our reports came out, they used the data to say it's too much, right? So there is negotiations everywhere, but there's also people who don't care. So in South Sudan, the SPLA doesn't care that the barges which move up and down the Nile, so you have a surplus producing area in the north, Renk, of sorgo, which produces so much sorgo that it could feed the whole country. And it needs to be shipped by barge to Juba, where there's the main market for sorgo. But they really don't care that the taxes are $10,000 per boat, the accumulated checkpoint taxes. So that it's cheaper to import sorgo from neighboring Uganda, where there's less simply because the space is shorter, there's less checkpoints, it's on the roads, it's cheaper. The government doesn't care that it's kind of underdeveloping economically its own country.
They're probably controlling the import as well.
Very likely, of course, and it's easier to make money from the imports than it is from
We've seen that in other cases. I mean, Liberia was also famous for this, the Liberian elite, the rice import, for example. And also in Liberia, it really produces enough rice to feed its own population, so there is no need for that import. But it's, that's where it's easy money for a political elite. But Stein, and please, if there are more questions, please raise your hand while Stein is speaking.
Thanks again. A great lecture and great angle to study my politics at the local level, which can be used to say something more general at a more abstract or macro level as well. I have a few questions regarding the operators of the roadblocks and the links to the processes of what you could call state building. If I understood you correctly, you basically distinguished between three types of roadblocks: those run by the government, those run by the rebel groups, and those that you called community roadblocks. Now, are there any differences in how they operate and in what their objectives are? And as for the government roadblocks, are they simply extra or income for the officers who man them and their superiors, or does something end up as actually state revenue? And secondly, sort of relatedly, I have been quite a lot in Tanzania, and there are roadblocks there as well, but I think they are largely government roadblocks run by the police or the military. And my understanding is that they are basically extra income for the officers who man them. And that's it. What explains the difference between how this functions in Tanzania on the one hand and in Kivu on the other?
Thank you. And there was one more behind that. I think we take that one as well. So please, you get the mic in a second.
Thank you. I was interested about the metaphor regarding corruption. We haven't heard the word rent-seeking at all, and I think this is exactly what it is. And I find your talk extremely interesting, but also deeply depressing in terms of state building. The countries that you've chosen are all failed states, and yet what we try and do, well, I think most people try and do, is try and build a state so it becomes a modern state. And we see that, in fact, before independence, the Congo was just jam-packed with infrastructure and everything was operating. And since then, it has gone downhill enormously. So I suppose the question is what is the options, or how can we see a way forward for all the people in the Congo? I mean, there's figures like 3 million people have died in the Congo through conflict and all kinds of things, and rape, and that is another dimension of it. So my question really is where do we find any kind of hope that we can develop a modern state, one that where the territory becomes part of the state and it is defended?
Thank you. Then you get the final word here, Per, so please.
Well, absolutely fascinating questions, all of them. And I think that just to start with the latter point about the Belgian Congo, right, and the infrastructure, it's really important to look at exactly what the Belgians did, how they did it, and what options they left to the post-colonial state. Because much of this road network of 152,000 kilometers, which is a lot for there, but not for Western Europe, but it's a lot, right? But it was maintained by forced labor. So the Belgians made it obligatory for local chiefs to maintain the road, to take forced labor. People had to dedicate 20 or 30% of their time to keeping these roads paved, so that or not paved but beaten, so that if the administration would come to take their money, that it could come and arrive quite comfortably at in the village, right? And so once a country becomes independent, it cannot impose forced labor on its own people anymore. So, within 3 months, 60% of the road network is gone.
But that's not the reason for the depletion of all that. I think it's much deeper than that.
It's also because the Belgians exported all the capital from the country, right? So I think there's definitely much more blame to be found in the way that the colonial administration left the country behind. But I think we should take the discussion at another moment. I'm much more optimistic than you are about what is going on, and I think that hope depends also in the eye of the beholder, right? And I think that there's also some kind of positive contestation of order going on. There's communities taking, who are being left behind by the state, who are taking things into their own hand to redistribute wealth out of long-distance trade in their communities. I think that's absolutely wonderful. But I do agree that this is also a form of rent-seeking, right? It's people taking a gun, sitting down by a public good which is pre-existing, namely a road, whatever the state it is in, or a trade route, and setting up shops, seeking rent out of control over a passage point. So I think that's a wonderful formulation. But I do think that Central Africa and the dynamics that you find here, that people can forge political power out of roadblocks, is very different than what you find in Tanzania and in West Africa, because West Africa is also rife with checkpoints, right, along main trade routes. So there's many of them in many parts of the world, but in some places it is mechanisms for states to maintain loyalty among their police officers and police corps. It's forms of corruption, if you will, that allow a state on a shoestring, whereas in other places it's being used to contest these states. What explains it? I don't quite know yet. You know, I think there's much more interesting questions to be asked. This is really definitely one of them. But it is important to note that in Congo, the rebels and the government are often the same, in the sense that the government is made up of integrated rebels, right? And the Central African Republic as well, it is bargaining between rebels and states. So sometimes rebel groups aren't opposed to the government, but actually an extension of government power. So then to speak about what is the difference in rebel and government taxation becomes difficult. As I show for the Central African Republic, the rebels largely mimic the state in terms of tax levels, in terms of naming even of their officers along roadblocks. So there's a lot to be said about that. But I do think that even in Tanzania and even in Kenya, as far as I know, there is a lot of private enrichment involved, so that the wife of the president is responsible for that tax authority, and the money will go directly to her, right? And each kind of state authority. But I hope that ultimately all this talk about roadblocks, right, and the kind of politics that might be involved is a nice provocative entry point, a simple, parsimonious entry point into a different kind of aspect of politics, right? Which I think is very pervasive. I don't think this story is just about Central Africa, although I focus on Central Africa. And I think that there's much more of a conversation to be had. And I hope that I've provoked some thoughts, and maybe some angry thoughts also, that can push the discussion a bit into that direction.
Great. Thank you, Per, and thanks to our audience. Thanks to those who are online, and please join me in giving a hand of applause.
Thank you. Before we end completely, if there's anybody who's interested in buying the book, I don't have it with me, but I do have a discount code that I can give you so that it's cheaper to buy the already ridiculously cheap paperback if you're interested. Thanks for being here.